Okay, hello, Jacek Bartosiak is speaking Strategy and Future, and with me today is Nicholas Myers. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Jacek. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm fine, but I hope that our audience will be fine after hearing what you have to say about the Polish terrain, Polish war theater, as today we will start discussing the Polish terrain characteristics in another episode about, sort of the military situation on NATO eastern flank.
Indeed. So maybe you won't be feeling the most fine at the end of it, but we'll be able to talk about all of the fun specific terrain features. We were thinking about Polish defense from the east in particular. So I was thinking of talking mostly about the area between Warsaw and Belarus today. I don't know if we'll get through all of it because it is more complicated than some people think, but I know you already know most of this stuff. It's good to finally get a chance to talk about it in detail.
Let's get started.
Indeed. So I can post the map if you.
Yeah, I need to allow you. Yes, that's true.
The core thing to bear in mind here,
Okay,
when
done.
thinking at the extreme level of granularity and detail between the Poland eastern section and the Belarusian border, is that we have two major infrastructure nodes. They're easy to remember. One's going through Grodno and the other through Brest. That's Brest in Russian and English and Brest in Polish. I tend to refer to it as Brest to distinguish it from the French city, which is also strategically important. One of the curiosities we have seen recently in terms of Russian military exercises is that while a decent amount of interaction has been maintained with the Belarusian brigade in Brest, that's the 38th Guards Airborne or Mobile Brigade, descended from the Soviet airborne troops. There has been relatively little interaction between the Russians and the forces up in Grodno, which is curious for a variety of reasons. I believe the last time, if I remember correctly, the last time the Russian ground forces actually participated in an exercise near Grodno was during Zapad 2013. So coming up on 7 years in the past, over 7 years in the past now. And I think it's that Zapad 2013 scenario that is the one that is the most relevant to discuss when we're thinking about Polish conventional defense today. So as a brief recapitulation, Zapad 2013 is sort of a classic risk to Central Europe that we were imagining 10, 15 years ago if we were thinking about the future of conventional war. Namely that the Russians were extremely concerned about a NATO conventional buildup in the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and that in the event of a proper conventional war, they would use these forces to put pressure on St. Petersburg, which would require the Russians to, instead of escalating with potential civilian casualties around there, counterattack into Poland in order to put the same risk against a major city in Warsaw, as well as cut off logistical capabilities over land from Poland north into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Now, the likelihood of this scenario was always very low. Even today, as Operation Atlantic Resolve is quite at a relative high point, there are not nearly enough NATO forces in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania to create real pressures against St. Petersburg. Perhaps that would change in a Biden administration, but I don't personally believe that that is coming. Nevertheless, how the Russian forces configured themselves for that exercise using what was not yet then the 1st Guards Tank Army, I think at the time it was still the 20th Guards Army, were concentrations at 3 polygons in Western Belarus. The first one is the major one here, south of Brest. The second one is out here. So the aviation polygon, I'm sorry. The one out here by Bernovici, I think they did use this polygon for a helicopter shooting, but the concentration of ground forces was here. And then the last one in the upper northwest corner of Belarus here at Gorsky Polygon, the Grodno location. As we look at those three spots in relation to eastern Poland, the first thing you'll see just on this map generically is this big green splotch right in the middle. This big green splotch is a national park. It's centered on the Narew River. I'm sorry, this is a bit south of the Narew River. This is just sort of a relatively intrafficable swamp area moving between major river systems. The Narew is much further north in
Shara. I think, Nicholas, this is Shara River tributary.
Oh, Shara. Okay. So we see that there's three major rivers, four major rivers that the Russian forces would need to be bearing in mind constantly if they were attempting to do a starting point attack on Poland from the Belarusian-Polish border. The first is quite easy to understand. It is the Wisła, the Vistula River for English speakers, the main river of Poland, around which is pretty much the only major strategic barrier inside of Polish territory. Much effort is going to have to be expended on figuring out how to cross this river at certain points if they're going to carry out the classic Russian tactic of surrounding a location in order to avoid potentially taking maximum military casualties. Similar to, but not exactly analogous to, the German Kessel system that was used in the 1940s. The second is the Bug River, which flows through Brest and then turns west into Poland itself. This one is much less of a tactical barrier, as some of Jasek's recent exploration has shown. Like most Polish rivers, it can grow and shrink pretty rapidly based on weather patterns. And as was discovered in 1939, during a drought period, is not much of a barrier at all. The third is the Narew River, further north. This one is interesting in as much as it's the last truly wild river of Europe. Very few levees anywhere. And it's great for those few nature lovers out there, but can create some unpredictability of what to anticipate on the ground as you're moving near it. And then the fourth river would be the Berezina River, which is much more of a rear Berezina is further back. No, I'm thinking of the Vepsh River, which is also a very small river in the southeast of Poland that cuts off Lublin from the main area where the battlefield would be in the event of a Russian advance into Poland. But Polish military history buffs will remember the Vepsh River as being the primary concentration point that Piłsudski used in order to cut off Tukhachevsky's advance across roughly the same terrain about almost exactly 100 years ago. Now, when we start to go into much greater granular detail about the advance, what we'll run into are a couple of choke points that are going to complicate any hypothetical Russian advance into Poland. The first is the city of Białystok. Everybody who studies the Russian military is aware that a key weakness the Russians have is urban warfare. They've been attempting to improve their capabilities of doing this, especially in the Western Military District, over the past several years, but it really has not gone particularly far. And indeed, the biggest advances that they have had in this are not so much the Russian armed forces, but in the Russian National Guard. And their role in a potential conflict here would be to secure the rear. And I honestly don't suspect that they would be employed on a very large scale actually during combat operations. It's much more likely that the Russians would seek to avoid Białystok altogether and try to take control of whatever bridges they can over some of this unpredictable swampy terrain nearby. So some of the difficulties that emerge around Białystok are how you're going to control some of the very few roads that cross a couple of the watery barriers nearby. Because if you're moving heavy equipment, as the Russians would be attempting to do in order to cut off a potential Polish counterattack subsequently in the campaign, it's quite difficult to move heavy equipment through some of this terrain. We have an impression in the West of Poland, and even more so Ukraine, being the ideal tank country in the world. And that's true of a large section of Poland, but a lot of that is in the central and northern portions, the areas where the Germans were most active at the start of the September 1939 campaign, and not so much the eastern portions. So in addition to having to secure several of the choke points going across the major rivers here, so Łopi or here outside of
Choroszcz, yeah, on the Narew River, the crossing.
I will defer to Jacek at all times over Polish pronunciation here.
Sure.
We then, regardless of whichever they choose, most likely they would do both. There's now a whole bunch of additional flanks that they need to secure against other forward Polish positions in the area. So there's, in addition to potentially having to shield against Polish forces in the northern division facing Kaliningrad that may or may not be actively engaged with Kaliningrad, with the Russian forces in Kaliningrad. They then need to, as the Russian occupiers, make sure that you control the towns of Ostrów Mazowiecka and Vyshkov because of their centrality to all road and rail networks on this particular northern section of the front between Grodno and Warsaw. It's one of those peculiarities that especially Vyshkov, unless you happen to control it, there is no way to actually to maintain a logistical order of forces north of Warsaw. As we move the map further to the southwest, Vyshkov is now quite close to Warsaw itself. And I believe, what is the name of this river again here? Is this where the Narew and the Bug are coming?
This is Bug. And it connects with Narew and Serock, as you see, right? Yes.
All right. So
and then they move toward and they connect with Vistula River here.
So the Narew River coming from the north here, and the Bug coming from the east, combined at Serock. Again, Polish military historians may remember that Serock is one of the key points in Napoleon's Iron Triangle defense concept of Warsaw. There are three major castles. I don't know if any of them still exist. I think all of them were pretty much destroyed in the course of the First World War, actually, when there was a siege of Warsaw in the course of the Gorlice Tarnów offensive by the German Empire. But Serock is one of those key points that need to be controlled in order to prevent potential long-range fires from being introduced into Warsaw itself. So what we would anticipate if the Russians were doing a conventional Zapad 2013 style offensive into Poland with the intention of shutting down political will to maintain a broader fight against Russia in Warsaw itself, is probably to bring their own longer range indirect fires, such as heavy MLRS or Uragan, or maybe even future systems like Koalicja, which may or may not actually be deployed at this point, to a place like Serock. In addition to which, while this is a key advantage the Russians may have, in order to actually continue the surrounding of Warsaw, it's difficult. They would need to somehow get over west of Serock, over closer to Nowy Dwór Mazowiecki, if I remember correctly, a second point of the Napoleonic Triangle.
Exactly. In Modlin, yes. Modlin.
Where they're building the new airport. But yeah, there it is, the new airport.
If I may, Nick.
Yes.
I need to say again, and especially to the audience, that I'm always overwhelmed by the vast knowledge that Nick is having about the country that actually, he doesn't come from, so to speak. About Iron Triangle, all those things. This is exactly so. Hitler was also contemplating the same concept during the Second World War, and was trying to restore the Iron Triangle in a way, and fortifications, for one particular reason that the Russians understand very well. You can never seize Warsaw directly with assault from east. You need to make sure that you make envelopment, sometimes double envelopment. Otherwise, the defender may easily defeat you, having the logistical hub in Warsaw and the bridges protected by the rivers, and also the Bug River and the Narew River and the Wieprz River. They are creating the possibility for the defender to beat you in the detail. I mean, to beat the offensive action in detail. And as we have done it many times in the past, defeating Russians in that way. So Poles know that very well as well.
A very important point. If you attempt to just assault Warsaw from the east, the terrain is fairly open and you can maintain a decently heavy assault, but you're also open to wherever the counterattacker decides to strike from, as Jacek is mentioning. So in 1920, most famously, the Pilsudski attacked from the south. These days, the only brigade I think that is currently there is an armored brigade in the eastern suburbs of Warsaw, which you might think is vulnerable. But if you disperse it into appropriate places with just company or even platoon level, you can so sufficiently maraud the Russians from almost every direction that you would just not be able to sustain that offensive.
And one more thing,
Yes.
Over the last 2 years, the decision has been made to move the combat readiness to full combat readiness of this brigade. And also the new Leopard tanks, modernized, are being used there. So this brigade is being geared up for the full combat readiness, and just to be ready just for this engagement.
In addition to this, even if the Russians felt much safer about their abilities to suppress this brigade right from the beginning, which I don't suspect they do, but assuming that they did, the primary fighting power of the Polish army is still based in the legacy bases that the Soviet Union allowed them to build along the western border with Germany, for obvious reasons within the Warsaw Pact. But while this may seem something of a disadvantage for the current combat situation today, and in some ways it is, it also means that the Russians have to assume that the primary fight is going to be the Polish counterattack as those forces move east. And to a certain extent, it's almost an advantage that there is some flexibility about how these forces are going to be inserted into the fight. That said, an additional division as this is currently being stood up is certainly not going to hurt Polish chances. So that covers the basic broad strokes of how an attack would move from the north, coming out of Grodno. The major controlling points to remember again being, how do you maintain logistics around Białystok when you probably can't control the city itself right from the start? So you have a variety of bridges that need to be controlled, in addition to doing a large-scale shielding force, probably through some light formations, I would suspect being deployed into Łomża and Ostrołęka. Now, now, some people might be wondering, the Polish division along the Kaliningrad border, probably you would assume it would be heavily engaged with the forces in Kaliningrad during this. This is not necessarily so. In fact, I would suspect, based on the patterns of Russian exercises that go on inside of Kaliningrad with the 11th Army Corps stationed there, that the Russians are much more concerned about the Poles attacking them there than they are thinking of attacking out. Now, I suspect that in the event of there being some form of pressures being put on to a Russian attack going along this northern branch, that the Russian forces in Kaliningrad may indeed start shelling some Polish units in order to keep the Poles fixed along the Kaliningrad border. But this is not a certainty, because Kaliningrad is one of those strategic assets that Russia holds, and it's going to be very unwilling to play with if they have the elective chance to avoid it, if only as an escalation management locus. So one thing that I would sort of assume in a future war conflict is that however much the shooting is actually going on elsewhere, Russia is going to be using whatever mechanisms it has available to communicate with the West, that they would prefer not to let Kaliningrad turn into a hot war zone, which may offer some flexibility for Polish forces that would otherwise be stationed there to bring pressures against the northern arm of a Russian encirclement of Warsaw coming in to Sieradz and Nowy Dwór Mazowiecki. So we'll go on to the second major point. You'll see here that between Białystok and Biała Podlaska or Podlaska?
Podlaska.
Podlaska. There is relatively little infrastructure. Now, I've driven through that area before with a joke of anti-tank cows. So if you just strap ATGMs to all the cows, Poland is perfectly safe. This area is going to be a difficult place to move between. So my suspicion is that a southern arm of a Russian attack is probably going to be routed off of completely separate logistics nodes coming out of Brest. And this is going to, as we were mentioning a moment before, it could follow the route that looks most obvious on the map. Just following this highway through Biała Podlaska, west of Pilawa, and then you can either divide the forces into pressures on the eastern suburbs of Warsaw, try to seize bridges to get to the west, and so forth. That's what looks most apparent on the map. However, I don't think that this is actually the most obvious, the most useful choice for the Russians if they were going to mount a successful attack. So the Vepsh River is this area here, and it combines with the Wisła and Yoblin, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. And it's this section right here between Yoblin and Kotsk that is the principal area from which Piłsudski had his force concentration against Tukhachevsky in 1920. My anticipation is that the Russian ground forces, probably combined with airborne troops attacked to complete the encirclement of encirclement of Warsaw, is going to be primarily aimed at gaining control first these two bridge crossings, and finally to enable Russian troops to cross the Wisła River down here in Yoblin, the major bridge crossing point, so that the fighting is farther away from Warsaw, where naturally there would be considerable political pressures to move Polish troops forward as a defense of the capital itself.
If I may add, Nick, it was very interesting. I was waiting patiently for you to develop this reasoning. Yeah, there is a rationale for doing like that. First of all, Russians have done that many times in the past. Again, as I said, they tried to attack Warsaw directly to no avail usually. So they like certain crossings, so to speak, okay? Dęblin, take a look. You have a major forest on the western bank of the river, which creates a screening protection for their crossings. Dęblin and north of it. This is what we call Kozienice. And there was some, for example, during the Second World War, there was a major bridgehead exactly there between Pileca River and Radomka River, and down south. You see those two, this is Radomka and Pileca a little bit up to Warsaw. And they always try to seize a few bridgeheads and see where it's easier to protect them. This is what they did in summer 1944, when the Warsaw Uprising was occurring, actually was lasting, and they seized it and they held it. The Hermann Goering's the German division didn't manage to push them back because there is a screening protection of the woods, and there is a heavy terrain protected from both flanks by Radomka and Pilica rivers, and also the Vistula River. So they know it. During the Soviet era of the Warsaw Pact, exactly there were already the concrete slabs allowing for heavy troops crossing, prepared in advance, okay? So that the Russians, the Soviets could, use the second, third echelon and so on, whatever happens, on the terrain. And there are many places like that on the Vistula River. So one assumption, the Russians know it very well. The Russians know where to cross the river. And in case of the Vistula River, it's not the river itself that is a major obstacle, but the Vistula River Valley is huge with escarpments, swampy places, a lot of water, free flows, very difficult to predict, unpredictable. So even if it's dry, the valley itself is a really thing to think about if you have heavy equipment. I wanted to add this to your description.
Oh, no, it's very important. So if we assume that at a certain point, relatively early in the conflict, that the Russian forces have somehow managed to gain control of a mechanism for crossing the Wisła River this far south of Warsaw, there's now multiple options available for continuing the exploitation, either to do a wide encirclement of Warsaw, or try to drive more narrowly up the river, or more likely doing a combination of these, in addition to having maybe not a significant force, but up to a brigade's worth of forces doing the direct assault on Warsaw, simply to draw the Polish forces and any other Polish allied forces apart as they are doing the final approach. One of the interesting points that needs to be remembered at this sort of granular level from what Jacek was just mentioning is that during the Cold War, many of those bridging points that the Soviets had left as a permanent crossing option for the Wisła River were US Air Force targets for missile strikes in the event of a serious war going on the inter-German border. While we in the West, we in NATO these days talk primarily about Russian missile threats to the Western world as it is, by drawing all of these silly maps with bubbles showing how far an Iskander can potentially shoot if it could shoot at every possible thing coming up. We need to remember that during the course of an operation like this, in which the Russians will be moving into Poland, missiles are far more useful for the West than they are for Russia, because we are going to need the ability to cut off certain pieces of crossable terrain, whereas the Russians actually do require them. So we need to stop thinking exclusively in terms of missiles being a grand Russian advantage. Perhaps they've got some better options for ground-launched missiles, but it's not always going to be to their tactical advantage when we're looking through these details. This may be an advantage for having more longer-range indirect fires options in the West, of being able to cut off these various ways in which the Russians must advance. The situation reverses a bit for the air war, but it's something to remember on this very close tactical level.
And that brings to the table the question that emerges then, because the rear area will be the logistical hubs in Belarus then. Yes. And there are critical barriers in the territory of Belarus that can be struck. The Nemunas River barrier with many, many bridges, Shchara River system, the Pripyat River system, and there are many choke points in Belarus that Poles know of, as we have had those wars at least 19 times with Russia, usually in Belarus. Okay, so back in 1920, not only did we defeat the Soviets on the Dnieper River and the Battle of Warsaw, but then there was another battle a month later on the Nemunas River when we pushed them east And that was exactly about controlling the crossing access on the Nemunas River so that we had a protective shield, so to speak. You need to break the Nemunas fortress, as we say in the Polish strategic culture, in order to control Belarus. So there are many choke points that with NATO, us, we could employ missiles effectively and making Russians short on logistics.
Very much so. And indeed, that's part of why that third polygon that was used in Zapad 2013 is the one near Bernovici. So the Belarusians have 3 brigades that they keep right on the western section of the country. That first I mentioned in Brest, then there's another one in Grodno itself, and then there's another one that at least used to be at low readiness in Slonim. The issue that they're anticipating here is that they need to be able to reinforce whichever side is advancing in order to ensure that the operation comes to some sort of long-term success, which especially back in 2013 when they were last running this exercise at full scale, the Russians were primarily concerned with the fact that though they might be able to achieve initial tactical victory, they had very little confidence in their forces being able to sustain the morale to achieve operational and strategic victory by conventional forces alone if they could not achieve an offensive success very rapidly. This, of course, brings up the possibility that there are quite a few weak points that Jacek was just listing within how these logistics are going to be sustained once the attack begins. And I would emphasize Bernovici, Slonim, to a lesser extent, Lida, as potential weak points in terms of First Guard's tank army logistics moving through Belarus. So there is no shortage of potential tactical targets for long-range fires that could really complicate this potential advance. I would close out this section on the conventional threat by, again, emphasizing that what we're looking at here is a very old-fashioned way of doing this type of war, and that we are not using Ukrainian territory to exploit this process. We need also to remember that if Ukraine, for whatever reason, suddenly became friendly to Russia to the point of potentially even allowing Russian forces to move across it, perhaps not the whole of the country, but across portions of the country in order to facilitate this attack. Seems difficult to imagine now, but Ukraine's political fortunes are unknown at this point. We can see that there are a variety of other potential axes that could be exploited south of Brest that could be used to further extend pressure against other Polish units that are stationed in the southeast of the country to prevent them potentially interfering with the Yoblin crossing. I don't think that any of these are necessary for the Russian attack to function in practice without proper ambush tactics to counter it. But we do need to remember that a friendly Ukraine, or at least a Ukraine that's going to prohibit Russian movements and be able to prohibit Russian movements, drastically reduces the number of difficulties that Poland is going to face in a conventional battle going on in its eastern territory.
Yes, it's good that you have noted that, Nick. We are preoccupied, it's true, that even with the Ukraine state being sort of independent but weak, the Russians may cut through Shatsk Park, touching a little bit of the Ukrainian territory and connecting to the logistical line through Helm, which they did in the past also many times when it was Soviet Union, the Second World War, and so on and so forth. And that would really extend our defenses and spread them out. exactly as you described. So we are thinking about this contingency as well. And that shows how important Ukraine is for Poland's defense plans. And let's assume that Ukraine is a strong country with a military and not corrupt. Then if you could zoom out, then the audience would see that the Russians actually, if Poland and Ukraine cooperate militarily, the Russians will not move at all. Because theoretically, if something is happening, Ukrainians can really threaten the communication lines all across the whole Belarus and even Russia proper. If this is a serious, campaign for domination of Central and Eastern Europe, and traditionally, then Poland and Ukraine join hands, okay, against Russian attempt for domination. So if this equilibrium is broken and NATO is not functioning going forward into the future, and if there is a growing tension palpable across Europe, who knows what might happen? Because the real factors are Poland and Ukraine in this part of the world. And take a look at Ukraine. The Russians might be feeling intimidated if Ukraine really delivers a proper statehood.
The other complicating factor, to return to some of the tactical granularity of Russian planning at the moment, is that currently in the Russian Western Military District, there are 3 armies capable of doing operational scale offensives. There's the 6th Army near St. Petersburg and Pskov, the 1st Guards Tank Army, which everybody's been talking about recently around Moscow, and then the 20th Guards Army, which I mentioned before, used to control what was the old central military district, now primarily based between Smolensk and Voronezh, facing Ukraine. Now, Western sources have focused inordinately on the 1st Guards Tank Army. For decent reasons, it's the most heavily armed of them all. But there is one key point that we need to remember in the distribution of these technologies between them. The 20th Guards Army has been receiving all of the long-range strategic communications capabilities that the Russians have been saying that they're fielding, but they are not cranking them out fast enough. As a consequence, my assessment is based on purely open source research that the 1st Guards Tank Army is capable of fighting as a coherent unit, but not in an especially dispersed manner at this moment, and not in a strategic offensive move. The 20th Guards Army, by contrast, has been training so that if they're, in my estimation is that if they perceived there to be a weakness in Ukraine that was causing the military to collapse, they would be able to move very deep into Ukrainian territory and be able to establish some sort of facts on the ground, similar to how Crimea was ultimately won, less through fighting than through instilling defeatism through the enemy. But if you are going to accomplish this on a huge amount of territory, as Ukraine, Belarus, or Poland are, as you can see just by glancing at the map, Ukraine period is much, much larger than just Crimea. Without the advanced C2 capabilities being currently distributed only really in the 20th Guards Army for the Western Military District, it is going to be extremely difficult to coordinate such a large-scale attack against another region. And whereas the 1st Guards Tank Army is relatively mobile and does do practice exercises inside of Belarus, sometimes moving forces up towards the borders of Latvia and Estonia, and a bit more rarely to the Ukrainian border, the 20th Guards Army rarely sends more than 1 regiment, one every year, to any other territory besides the traditional missile testing grounds in Kapustin Yar, for example. So this needs to be borne in mind here. The 20th Guards Army, as it currently exists, is not moving from the Ukrainian border because that is its area of responsibility. But without the equipment that's currently deployed in the 20th Guards Army, it's very difficult to imagine that Russia would be able to successfully coordinate all of the details of such an incredibly complicated mission going on in Poland, especially considering how a lot of the command and control networks for this attack would be run from St. Petersburg and Moscow, which are getting precisely the number of kilometers away from Warsaw, but a substantial amount.
1,200.
1,200 kilometers, which is strategic range as far as radio troops are concerned inside of Russia. So again, one of the most interesting things when we discuss the future prospects of warfare is how much the tactical, the operational, the strategic levels scatter across certain things. But this extremely tactical detail about radio deployments shows just how much Ukraine is complicating any Russian planning for an attack on Poland.
Yeah, and of course, in Warsaw, we know that. That's why we have always supported independence of Ukraine. And Nick, as you know very well, we even went to war over that thing. Like in 1920, in May, we wanted to create independent Ukraine and anchor it there to balance Russia as well and create a federation so that we counterbalance Russia together if it were to emerge as it did later on as Soviet Union. So this is a non-negotiable interest of the Polish statehood, so to speak. I will say even more that I also think that this is why we supported all the revolutions in Ukraine, Orange and the other, just trying to make sure that those countries here are, that we call intermarium, are not engulfed by the Russian power projection. And we've been consistent. Irregardless of the left or right wing party, it has been a consistent feature of the Polish state grand strategy. And it has been like that for many centuries, by the way. One more thing I wanted to add is that it's a good zoom now. This is what in our old scripts we were referring as a Polish war theater, from Smolensk to the Oder River and from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathians. And it's a vast territory, a maneuverable warfare. And this vast territory is divided into two halves by the Pripyat River, by the Pripyat marshes, by the Polessia marshes right here. And of course, you can't see that on the map, but if you move the forces, actually you have two theaters. And the good thing for Poland was that we had those buffer zones between Smolensk and Kiev to Poland proper, and we could see where the main thrust is coming, so we could defeat the aggressor in detail using the pivot of Brest, the Brest fortress. And that was exactly our war plan in 1939 that we were having ready for the Soviets. Instead, we were fighting Germans, and we were not prepared for that because the Polish military was preparing for the war with Soviets, not with Germans, for 20 years. And this is exactly what our great war plans looked like in old times of the First Commonwealth. So we were sucking in, using the territory as strategic depth, channeling the movement, and then we were hitting, using Warsaw as a main communication hub with a preceding fortress of Brześć, from which we could sort of pivot against the enemy.
Well, I think, yes. I think that clarifies all of the tactical details for the immediate theater and sort of this triangle that exists between the Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, Tri-Point, Warsaw itself, and then the area near Khelm and the Brest corner here. Again, as with virtually everything that the Russians may attempt to try or how to counter them in addition, The key weakness here in an era in which there is just a much lower force to space ratio is going to be the limits of infrastructure. And so for those of you who need to do all of the tactical measurements here, there was an enormous amount of effort put into the Cold War era research on what were the technical capabilities of West German and even East German in bridges, road capacities, and things of that nature. Since the road networks and the rail networks as well are of much lesser density in this region, which is probably going to be the key operational territory to control in the event of a Russia-Western conflict in the future. Figuring out precisely what those carrying capacities are is probably the next step of research that needs to occur so that we can begin to understand what are the tactical limits of Russian movement at any given time, and then move on to the next stage of understanding how much Russian rear troops are going to be, how many Russian rear troops are going to be necessary to sustain any sort of significant offensive. So that way, when we watch Russian exercises occur, it's much, much easier to determine whether or not it's a serious buildup or it's just an exercise, how much of this infrastructure is in fact ready to be put into place to sustain something of this nature. And I think that would do much to actually build confidence between both sides, actually, if we understood these issues, that we wouldn't need to accuse the Russians of preparing an invasion absolutely every time that they do an exercise.
Mm-hmm. Two more observations I would have, and I hope that, of course, I'm joking now, that they might act as a deterrent against Russian thinking that we are not, preparing ourselves for the scenario, is that there are new infrastructure, for example, river canals that were built over the last 70 years in this part of Poland, that the Soviets and the Russians have not trained and exercised and have never been at war. They've never had to try because they are new, okay? And even I was surprised that they are barriers of no, they have some significance, okay? For example, they intersect the battlefield so that we can have a lot of sort of traps and ambushes, and especially the rear areas. I think that there is some potential to create some surprises as well. And the other thing is, if you could zoom in to see the Pilica River south of Warsaw a little bit, an interesting development has occurred. This is exactly the Pilica River, which is like 30, 40 kilometers from Warsaw, south of it. So once the Russians could cross the Vistula River south of the Pilica River, as we discussed 10 minutes ago, they would need to move north to seize Warsaw, okay? Or at least make an envelope. But Pilica is not a small river. It looks small, but it has a horribly swampy banks and heavily forested. It's a perfect operational barrier from which you can really identify the main channels. There are only a few bridges, perfect towns that are like protective screens. You can put artillery, long-range drones, and you can kill the crossing troops. I mean, there is no good place to cross this damn river. And you can be annihilated if you really do it not in a smart way. Moreover, if you could move up a little bit and zoom out a little bit, Nick, the infrastructure here west of Warsaw, this is the center of Polish infrastructure, highways, railways. So it's a perfect staging area for our reserve troops, heavy armor brigade that we are having in the west, and that we can move either south to counter the Pilica crossing, east across the bridges in Warsaw to counterattack any attempt to seize Warsaw directly, and also to, if you hold the bridges north of Warsaw, you can move against this wing of attack on Ostrołęka modeling, as you mentioned just at the beginning, which shows how important Warsaw is and how important the rivers surrounding Warsaw are for channeling the movement of the enemy. And given the modern warfare capabilities, long-range fires, reconnaissance, that creates immense defensive capabilities for a well-trained and organized force. Nick?
Well, yes, the Pilica River is one of those barriers. That's like the last one I haven't had a chance to visit myself personally. So thank you very much for the increased data on that. I think that concludes everything about the tactical details here. So what are we going to discuss next time, Jacek?
I think that we will discuss maybe the Poland's war theater in a more general terms, looking also to the west part of the country, taking a look at the missile warfare as well. And maybe in yet another episode, I will convince you to talk about the Western Pacific this time, Nick.
Oh, we'll see.
I see. Okay. So far, so good. For the time being, that's it. Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you, audience, for bearing with us, so to speak, and hoping that you will stay tuned and you will be with us going forward into the future. Thank you very much, Nick.
Right.